Let us go to our next guest, and we are calling now on Colonel Derek Harvey to talk about what we have just heard. Colonel Harvey, welcome to America's Forum. To repeat what we just heard from John Bachman, apparently different press organizations within France are saying law enforcement took out the Kouachi brothers there at that print shop in the industrial park adjacent to Charles de Gaulle Airport, that both Kouachi brothers apparently have been killed by law enforcement and that the hostage reportedly has been freed. Your reaction to that information, sir?
News, and this is just the beginning of the story. There's a lot more that has to be done by police and intelligence officials there to determine the degree of the networks that these two individuals and others were working with, and who supported them, what were the ties to GIA or AQIM in the Maghreb of North Africa, or Al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula. There's a lot of work that has to be done here, and it's just the beginning.
Colonel Harvey, the Kouachi brothers were quoted as telling law enforcement earlier today that they wanted to die as martyrs to the so-called Arab street and to those Islamic enclaves that surround Paris and other French cities. Will the Kouachis be regarded as martyrs?
Well, clearly they'll be regarded as martyrs in a segment of that community, and there's probably some empathy for what they did against the publishers there that produced those cartoons. The defamation and mockery of radical Islam and of the Prophet is probably seen as a cause that is worthwhile by some in that community. The majority, though, are going to be very concerned about what's going on in their community. They're going to try and disassociate themselves from it, and they're going to be concerned about backlash. It's a very delicate situation in France, and it's not like the United States. There's much less assimilation and integration in France than what we've had in the United States.
Well, this whole notion of a lack of assimilation, French cultural integrity, as espoused by Académie Française, and just an unwillingness, as I understand it, Colonel, for law enforcement to even go into some of those Islamic neighborhoods, that in essence Sharia law and an Islamist culture has enveloped those areas, not only in Paris but in other French cities. Is there indeed the chance that now, at seemingly the 11th hour, some sort of assimilation will start to take place in France?
Well, there has to be a rethinking about how they've approached these issues and the underlying allegations of racism and segregation that permeate parts of that community. Both Africans and Arabs feel that, and it's reported in surveys and of many types. So the question is going to be, how do they address these problems, these underlying issues? Because at the end of the day, what we're looking at are the symptoms of underlying problems in the society: economic frustration, dislocation, social issues, and we're looking at the symptom, which is radicalization and violence. There will always be, and this is important, there will always be hardline jihadists who believe that they will give no ground and will not accommodate modernization and will not accommodate living in a diverse modern society. But these underlying problems allow them to mobilize and recruit people that they might not have had an opportunity to, and that's the problem.
Colonel, there has been debate here in our own country as to our approach in dealing with Islamofascism. There are some who argue, for example, that incarceration at Gitmo fuels the rage of radicals abroad. There are others who say any effort to step back is interpreted as appeasement that likewise emboldens would-be terrorists, whether here or abroad. Where do you come down in that debate here domestically? Has U.S. foreign policy fueled the rage of Islamofascists?
I think we will have Islamic radicalization and targeting of Western and American interests, regardless of how we would change U.S. policy and adapt to demands and interests of these types of people. it's going to be there one way or the other. It's about how do you manage it and mitigate it and keep it from growing in any size and scope. That's the challenge. I take a harder line. I think we need to see where we can find reconciliation. But at the end of the day, there are those that we will never be able to reconcile with, and they're going to continue to exist, and we're going to need to maintain a hard line. And too many of the things we've done in the last 4 or 5 years has been seen as appeasement, waffling, and weakness in the United States, from the United States. So that motivates them even more in some ways.
Let me take a historical reference from over a decade ago. In the wake of 9/11, following the initial shock and horror of that situation, Newsweek, the magazine, had a cover story with almost a plaintive interrogative on its cover. Why do they hate us? And while understanding different cultures is important, Colonel, it sounded to me almost to be akin of trying to ask a mugger who is attacking you, gee, pal, did you develop these problems in childhood? In other words, when there is a clear and present danger, isn't action required rather than contemplation or examination of, quote, root causes? Or how can those two very different approaches coexist in terms of battling Islamofascism?
Well, clearly we have to do both. You have to, and it's like a doctor. You have to treat the symptom. You see there's a fever. You have to treat the fever. You have to get the fever down. But you have to understand the underlying cause. Is it a chronic disease? Is it cancer? Is it the flu? What? And then you treat that for the longer term. We have some real problems here. There's a fight within Islam that we see between the Islamic State and other jihadists like Al-Qaeda. And we have all of those jihadist groups fighting more moderate establishment Islam in the Sunni Arab community. And then you have a fight between Shia and Sunni at various levels. That's one dynamic. But this idea of apostasy and blasphemy and these types of things, these are deeply rooted, and it's part of law in places like Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. This is not just an outlier where people strike out and think people should be killed because of some blasphemy. This has deep roots in many of these countries.
Mindful of that, and returning to our own approach in this battle, President Bush coined the phrase, quote, war on terrorism. That has been criticized because you really can't combat a tactic when you're dealing with an ideology. And now President Obama and those who have become part of his national security apparatus, Colonel, as I understand it, they've gone so far as to strike the terms Islamism and Islamofascism from the lexicon of both the Pentagon and the State Department. How do you evaluate the Obama administration's current approach to national security and this kind of politically correct lexicon they're insisting on?
The most significant strategic errors are usually caused by failing to define the problem and the threat properly. If you don't define it and understand it ahead of time, you're not going to be able to craft and articulate strategies, be they social, security, counterterrorism, or economic, to address it. Clearly, there is a problem within Islam, and deferring or avoiding the subject does not help you address the real problem, be it the immediate terrorism or the underlying causes.
Well, mindful of that, Colonel, given your background with CENTCOM and now your work in academia, if you were to define terms, if you were to describe what we are seeing internationally and what is at stake, what descriptions would you lend? What definitions would you provide?
Well, I would clearly say that we have got a violent course ahead of us, very disruptive and very, very problematic. And the problem is this: we do have violent jihadist Islam that is being mobilized and developed through very modern social media techniques, very sophisticated networks that know how to use money and finances and modern trading activities. They're very adept in many ways. Okay, these are not people hiding in caves anymore. This is a real challenge. And I think if we don't define that, we're going to be in some real difficulty. And I think that's the root issue here. If we don't define the problems, we're going to be in trouble.
The definition of terms being so vital to the situation, really, for any honest discussion, for any military action, for clear debate in foreign policy and national security, a clear definition of terms is required. Colonel Harvey, you have offered your forecast for the days ahead. It seems implicit, and maybe you want to say this explicitly, I hope I'm understanding you correctly. You believe that now we will see more attacks, correct? Including attacks or attempted attacks here on our soil?
Very clearly, there's the intent to do so, and there is a capability to do so. The question is matching those, and when will it happen? We do not know when a strike will occur, just like we did not know about 9/11 or some of the other strikes. We had an idea because there was capability, intent, and some chatter. We don't know what we don't know, and that's what worries me the most about the potential for strikes here at home. And the lone wolf problem is growing, especially with the ability to mobilize and recruit people through the internet and social media.
And you mentioned lone wolves. Colonel Harvey, hold that thought.